Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is how animals deal with winter, nature's nap time. And it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Jean Lawrence. Jean, it's great to see and hear you again today. I'm going to turn it right over to you because I know you've got a lot to share with us.
Thank you, Sunny. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, and it's very appropriate for most of what's happening in North America right now, which is winter. And how does the natural world deal with winter? Well, I'm going to talk about myself just a little bit. I am an expedition leader. I guide in Yellowstone, Glacier, the canyon area of Grand Canyon, Bryce Zion, and also in Churchill. And I love winter. It's one of my favorite seasons. I love to ski. It's got many attributes about it, but how do the animals deal with winter? So let's look into what's going on in winter. Well, in the temperate zones in the world, we see cold temperatures, and we also see a shorter day length. Those are the two main things that are happening. And we call that shortening of the day length a decrease in the photo period. It's often a very important cue or trigger for wildlife as well as plants. And therefore, there's also a scarcity of food. So these are some big challenges that animals have to think about and adapt to for their lives to continue. So even when we look at plants, they're going into a dormancy. We see leaves dropping from trees. Plants aren't photosynthesizing as much. So there's definitely dormancy going on all over the place. And for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to focus on animals that we would find in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And, of course, there's dormancy and hibernation going on all over the planet. But just because I'm familiar with the plants and animals of Yellowstone, that's what I'm going to be using as my examples today. Snow is a daily part of my life and animals' lives. What does it do? Well, it reflects solar radiation so that the ground stays cold, and it also dampens sound. It also creates beautiful landscapes. But what about trying to adapt to all this or live in this situation? Well, there's the classic strategies to deal with winter. And this is often listed as migration, adaptation, and hibernation. This is just kind of the paradigms that you see presented in the literature. Let's look at migration first. And birds are famous for this. On the left here, we have a peregrine falcon. They fly south. They go all the way to Argentina to spend the winter. So they just leave. They just have the ability to fly all the way to South America. There are some birds who fly more regionally, and it's what I would think of as a vertical migration. They're just going from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. And it could just be you stay on the same mountain, but instead of being at the summit or the top, you go down to the valley and spend the winter there. So flight definitely allows some movement for birds. What about mammals? Well, look at elk, for example. The migration to a winter range. You just move from possibly higher elevations up in the mountains to lower valleys, and you're using your own 4 feet. This is a picture of the National Elk Refuge in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which is part of Grand Teton National Park right next to it, the National Elk Refuge. And so we see a higher density of elk than in the summertime, but they know where to go, where it's going to be warmer, easier to get food. There's still water available. So just another migration strategy. Let's move to adaptations. So one would be, stay put, stay where your habitat is located, and just grow a winter coat. And most of these mammals I'll be mentioning do shed their summer coat into a winter coat. But one of the hallmarks of adapting, staying in the same habitat, is the mountain goat. Look at that big furry winter coat, looks super warm. Another adaptation would be change color. Just keep living where you live, stay in your habitat, but you need to stay camouflaged and blend in so you can keep eating. And this is the snowshoe hare. They're so called the snowshoe because their back feet are quite a bit larger than their front feet or paws. And so that gives them more stability on the snow, and they can move around quite well. And you see the hair in the back has the brown summer coat color. So they just shed and change color. So ptarmigan would be another bird that's kind of following that same pattern. Another adaptation, another example would be the ermine. And this is a short-tailed weasel. We call them an ermine in the wintertime because they change to white, and this is a form of camouflage, and they're also a predator. So this increases their skill in looking for rodents in the wintertime. How about prepare? There's some mammals, I'm looking at mammals pretty much right now, that have a strategy to stay active all winter, but they're going to prepare for this period of scarcity by, creating middens. They stockpile cones, they bury them in the ground, and then they can just go back to that cache or the midden and eat cones, or even go up into the trees and get more cones. And you might have seen scales scattered beneath trees in the wintertime. And that's, like our red squirrel here has prepared. What a great role model here. So prepare for winter. Another expert at preparing is the pika. And this is a rabbit. Actually, it's a very small rabbit. We sometimes refer to it as a rock rabbit, and it lives in the high alpine. And where those talus slopes are, where you have all the rocks, they will actually live in and under the rocks. And when winter is approaching, they collect vegetation, and they make we call it a hay pile, or they have a stash of vegetation. And then when the snow starts falling, they just live under the rocks and then go to their vegetation piles and feed on that all winter long. So amazing that this little rabbit can survive winter up in these very harsh environments. Well, some of our friends live sub-Nivean. These are the mice, the voles, or small rodents. They will live underneath the snowpack. And usually you need about 6 inches of snow, and this temperature in or underneath the snow never goes below freezing. It never goes below 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 Celsius. So that can be quite a cozy place to be. And also think about the wind. There's no wind or wind chill factor when you are burrowing and moving around underneath the snow. So this is also an adaptation. Use snow to your advantage. When we saw that little ermine before, the weasel, they're looking for rodents underneath the snow. That's also a food source for ermines, for foxes, for coyotes. So it's a food web right there in the snow. Let's look at the last strategy, which is going to be our biggest category today, which is hibernation. And you see a lot of definitions of, who's a hibernator, who's a true hibernator. Is this really just dormancy? There's a lot of discussion on that point, but we would definitely consider rodents a true hibernator, like the Uinta ground squirrel. And what is hibernation? We're always going to look at this as a response to cold winter, once again, in our temperate climates. And so what has to happen in hibernation usually defines as a reduction in metabolic rate, heart rate, respiratory rate, and body temperature. So, the definition is kind of looking for all these physiological processes to be lowered. And once again, rodents are considered the true hibernators. Their body temperature can actually approach freezing. So 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 Celsius, but not below. So that's pretty amazing. And their body temperature, everything lowers: body temperature, metabolic rate, heart rate. They also have the ability to rouse. So maybe every 4 to 10 days, that certain rodents have the ability to rouse, feed, defecate, urinate, depending on what's going on in the environment. So here's another look at our Uinta ground squirrel, and I see these guys quite often in Yellowstone. They're really endearing, and they generally disappear late August. And these rodents know the protein content in grasses and vegetation is dropping, right? We see grasses, it's not green and wonderful anymore. It's drying up, it's brown. Well, they know that. And they know the nutritional value is decreasing and it's time to go underground, get into your burrow. Also, they know the day length is decreasing, so they know what's coming. And so this is an animal that will be hibernating for like 8 months until spring. So one of our longest hibernators in the Yellowstone ecosystem. What about bats? This is a picture of a myotis, a little brown bat. And they're also considered a true hibernator because their metabolism, heart rate, and body temperature will drop in response to environmental changes. So they're going to look for a roost, like a cave, maybe old mine shafts during the winter time. And it's pretty amazing. Their heart rate drops from 200 to 300 beats per minute to 10 beats per minute. And they can actually go several minutes without taking a breath. So they're slowing way down, and this is conserving energy. And they can also utilize fat stores. And it's all a balance, because if you're going to try to forage for insects that are no longer there in the winter environment, it's just not going to be viable to stay active. So they go into the dormancy, they go into a hibernation. All these places where animals roost or where they burrow, it's often called a hibernaculum. So this is going to be specifically for dormancy or hibernation, where they go and hang out, whether it's roosting or burrowing or what have you. Okay, well, we've been looking at mammals, birds. What about amphibians? So do they hibernate? and they're cold-blooded, right? They're ectotherms, so they rely on the sun, they rely on heated rocks, they're relying on warmer places to move or warm water. Well, what about Columbia spotted frog, for example? This is an aquatic frog, and they're going to find a place underwater to hibernate. And so sometimes we often say brumate for reptiles and amphibians because, well, they're not warm-blooded, they're cold-blooded, so they get their own name for what they do in the wintertime. So brumation, they're going to be staying in water like fish, usually areas where it does not freeze, and so they can just overwinter. And they are definitely going into a type of a hibernation. Sometimes they're in large groups in their hibernaculum. And frogs are pretty amazing too because they have antifreeze, most species. So ice crystals can form in such places as the body cavity, the bladder, and under the skin, but they maintain a high concentration of glycogen in their vital organs, which prevents freezing. So animal may, a frog may appear frozen, but they're still alive. So that's an aquatic frog. They're an incredible, beautiful frog, which I've seen quite a bit in the lakes of Yellowstone. What about our terrestrial amphibians, the ones who live on land, like the western toad? See that nice dorsal stripe, that white stripe on the toad, always a great identifier for the toad. Well, they're gonna find some type of burrow and hide deep down into the soil below the frost line and just wait for things to warm up again. So they're really dependent on temperature of the environment or the amount of sun and shade so they can regulate their body temperatures. Well, what about reptiles? These guys are cold-blooded. They're ectotherms. They're relying on the external environment to keep their body warm. And here we see the common garter snake. This is definitely the most popular snake in Yellowstone and the ecosystem. It's a non-venomous snake, by the way. And yeah, when I think about Yellowstone, I don't think of it as a great place for snakes. It's a very difficult place, but these guys survive, right? They brumate in late autumn. Once again, they know that cold weather is coming, the photo period is decreasing, so they will find some type of burrow. They will be, or a hibernaculum, they'll be with other snakes of their kind, right? Other garter snakes can sometimes be together. And they don't really have a choice because when it gets cold, they can't digest food, they can't drink water, so they just go into a state of brumation or hibernation. Well, what about going back to our mammals, our endotherms? So the mammals that we've been looking at are endotherms. They generate their own body heat, and it's actually a pretty high body heat, right? We're usually around 99, 102. For most mammals, we keep it a pretty high temperature. And it's interesting, in the literature, you see controversy about bears, like, oh, no, they're not true hibernators. No, that's just dormancy. But you see some arguments against that. So I guess the way to really think of it is that bears have their own type of hibernation because they're actually extremely efficient at getting through the winter. Now, all this criteria that I mentioned before with the metabolic rate dropping, the heart rate dropping, the respiratory rate dropping, the body temperature dropping, well, bears don't really drop that much in temperature. maybe a degree or two, but nothing like we see with the rodents or the reptiles. So that's where it sometimes comes up that people say, well, they're not true hibernators. But I think the way to end that argument is just say, it's bare hibernation. And here we're looking at the American black bear. Here, they often den in protected areas with roots or tree branches or trunks or rocks, things that help the American black bear find a den, because they have short claws, so they're really good at climbing, but they're not the best den diggers compared to somebody else. So they look for all these attributes, and we see in this photo, yeah, they've made a fluffy little bed with bark chips, and they're definitely underneath some tree branches. So let me give you some numbers here. What about heart rate? We know the temperature doesn't drop that much. Heart rate, on average, 40 beats per minute, can drop as low as 8 to 10 beats per minute during hibernation. So bears exhibit some amazing physiology. They maintain their bone mass and density. And I'm just kind of broadening that to all bears right now. No osteoporosis. Once again, they do not eat or drink while hibernating. They do not urinate or defecate. Now you wonder how can that work? So the urea, the nitrogenous waste, is reabsorbed across the bladder wall, and the subsequent breakdown to amino acids form proteins to maintain the muscle mass. That is amazing. Do you think NASA would want to know about that metabolic pathway? Absolutely. One of my professors at the University of Wyoming was studying all this hibernating physiology, and he was funded by NASA. Yeah, wouldn't that be great if our astronauts could do that? It's pretty amazing. Well, the bear can do it. So I just mentioned the claws on the American black bear. In comparison, we have the grizzly bear, which they have quite long claws. They're known for their digging. They are actually excellent at digging, and so they can dig their own den. They can sometimes dig their own den each season if they want to. So we have this grizzly bear. Of course, he's surrounded by these beautiful granite boulders, but remember, bears are opportunistic. If you find a great place to den, why not use it? But all the physiology I just mentioned, we'd see that also in a grizzly bear. Same habits shared by all bears. So den selection. Once again, we see the American black bear, and by the way, they don't have to be black. It's in the name, but they can be cinnamon, they can be blonde, they can be white, and we still see a lot of variability in the coat color. And here's another American black bear utilizing attributes of the environment to select a den site. And then you might want to wonder, well, what do they have to do to prepare for hibernation? Well, they do need to bulk up, right? What's mainly going to be burned in hibernation is fat stores. So when it's fall, the bear will go into what we call hyperphagia, and they're going to eat like crazy. They're going to eat and sleep. That's all they're doing, because they're trying to build up their fat stores. And that can be as much as 20,000 calories per day. So bears know what's coming, and it's kind of a matter of life and death. You have to have enough fat stores, or you're not going to make it through your your hibernation period. One thing also that's very interesting is bears often like north-facing slopes if they have a choice to choose, because north-facing slopes accumulate more snow, and snow is insulating, as we know about all the animals that live in the subnivean zone. So that's also something that bears select for, because they're going to be nice and cozy and insulated in their den. Well, what about female bears? And this is, both grizzly and American black bear. What is so special about the den area? Well, think about having cubs, and the den is protection from the environment. So the female, actually, she goes through what is known as delayed implantation. So bears breed in the spring, and there's an embryo from breeding that does not immediately implant in the uterus, but it's maintained in a state of dormancy. And then the embryo implants in the fall. So we call that delayed implantation. And the body fat stores must be sufficient for the mother to go ahead and give birth in the den. So once again, fat is so important. So she's going to give birth in the den while she is hibernating. And also she's going to be lactating so that the cubs can nurse. And they're typically born in January, little cubbies. And, they're kind of a little bit rousing, but they're sleeping and nursing, and that's about it. And, when they're born, they're about 1 pound. They're little guys, and then they weigh about 20 to 30 pounds when they're emerging out of the den in the spring with the mother. And, we know that black bears, the cubs stay with mom for 2 years. So they may be born in the den and spend another year hibernating with mom in the den. And then grizzly bears, we know the cubs stay with mom for 3 years. So they're no strangers to hibernating. And remember, females are going to lose about 25% of their body mass while they're hibernating in the den. So remember they're dealing with their own body condition, and then they're also supporting their cubs. When we're talking about lactation in the den with the cubs of the year, or the coys. Okay. So I'm going to talk about another kind of bear, and I just have a disclaimer that we're going to talk about polar bears, and the polar bear does not live in Yellowstone. So here's a disclaimer. Don't want you to get that wrong. I've worked up in Churchill, so I've had a chance to observe polar bears, and they share some things with black bears and grizzly bears, but they also have some things that are very different and very interesting. So I just wanted to bring that up while we're talking about bear hibernation. So this is a male polar bear, and males do not den. They do not have a hibernation spent in the den. They actually have what's called a walking hibernation. So remember, for polar bears, winter is the time of food. It's not a time of scarcity. This is the time when they can go out on the ice and where they can hunt seals. So this is actually the time to gain body fat and bulk up. Summer is the time for food scarcity. We can say they don't have sufficient, or let's say any protein intake that's of any consequence. So they might have, berries and catch a bird or two, or go eat some kelp, but they're not catching seals, right? They're up on the open water, polar bears are not going to be able to catch seals. They're too fast. So winter, in complete contrast to our bears in the temperate zone, this is their time to eat. And they can really be indeterminate growers. They can, as many seals as they can catch and eat. There's food availability. They also prefer the blubber or the fat on the seals as opposed to the meat. Now, if a bear's hungry, they're going to eat whatever they can, but the blubber does not require a huge intake of water to digest. So, which meat does, which the protein does. So it's kind of interesting. They like the very rich, calorically rich blubber of the seal. And this guy, as you can tell, this large male is doing very well on protein intake. Well, what about female bears, female polar bears? And one way, of course, to identify a female versus a male, body shape, and also the females are the ones with the cubs. And the female polar bears are the only polar bear to hibernate. So once again, they are giving birth in the den, and it's protection from those very harsh Arctic and subarctic winters. And in the Churchill area, for denning sites, these females are looking for the black spruce. They're going underneath the roots, which make a nice ceiling for their den, and that's where they'll spend the winter. And we were talking earlier about American black bears losing 25% of their body weight during the hibernation process and giving birth. Well, polar bears have been measured to lose 43% of body mass while fasting and lactating in the den. That's huge. So, and imagine bears, they can have 1 cub, 2 cubs, 3 cubs, and then there's more demands. The polar bear has very high milk fat content in the milk they nurse to their young. So that's probably part of also why the body mass lost is greater in polar bears. Okay, please ask me any questions about any of these bears. And I'm just going to kind of wrap up here with this beautiful picture up near the northern range of Yellowstone. And remember that, we always want to help wildlife conserve energy during the winter time, and also appreciate and marvel at the array of diversity in all the challenges these animals have to solve problems in the wintertime. It's quite amazing what they can and have dealt with, all these different strategies. So maybe before we condemn winter because we've just slipped on the ice, but think about it as a time to rest and restore, a time of rejuvenation, and for many of the nature's nap time. This is the time to renew for becoming spring. So at this time, I just wanted to end my presentation and open that up to any questions that anyone might have.
So much. Okay. So starting off with hibernation, does the blood chemistry change for hibernating small animals? Do they produce some sort of antifreeze so that the water content doesn't freeze?
Not that I've come across in the literature.
And do you have any knowledge of the white nose fungus that's killing bats, which this viewer believes primarily interrupts their hibernation?
Oh yeah, especially, I'm not a bat person, but we know that the, you know, hibernaculum or the roosting areas for bats are usually colonial, or they're in nurseries. And so I know the white nose disease is spreading um, very, very quickly. And I could certainly imagine that would interrupt their hibernation.
Hmm. So since cubs stay with the mom for 2 years, does a mama bear not breed for 2 springs as
That's
she raises
right.
those cubs? Okay.
Yeah, they do not go into estrus.
Hmm.
So the American black bear, this is true for all the bear, um, American black bear, the grizzly, and the polar bear. So as long as her cubs are with her, she does not go into estrus. Now, when
Hmm.
she's ready to uh, look for a mate, when she's gonna, you know, move on, she bids her cubs adieu. She's taught them well how to survive, and so they will basically go on their way after 2 years or 3 years in the spring, and that's when she would be available to find a mate.
Hmm.
But before then, she does not go into estrus, and that's sometimes where she usually stays away from males also, because the males, the boars, they know that if they harm the cubs, if the cubs aren't there anymore, then they could potentially breed with her. So that's why she just stays out of the way. That's also an interesting thing about when do you come out of the den? Well, usually males come out first. And in Yellowstone, that could be early as mid to late March, depending on snowpack, food availability. And then the females come out of the den, and especially ones with cubs, they come out 3 weeks later. They just stagger their timing. They don't want to have any interaction with the males.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay, so moving on to a different animal. What makes a pika, or why is the pika classified as a rabbit instead of a rodent?
That's a great question. You know what? You look at the teeth. So rodents have, the hallmark of rodents are incisors, big incisors. And pika do not have those large incisors. I think of beaver and yeah, it's the dentition. So pika don't, they have teeth that are like snowshoe hare and cottontail rabbit, and so they just have a different dentition, and so that puts them in a different family.
Hmm.
I,
This is an
yeah, I'm sorry. And you know what? You just go on the internet and look up like rabbit teeth, pika teeth. And they have, I mean, I've never gotten a pika to open its mouth. Well, actually, they do. They do open their mouth when they call.
mm-hmm.
They kind of make a eh. So you can see their teeth when they open their mouth, if you're up in the high alpine.
Hmm.
But yeah, puts them in a different family.
So here's a tricky one. Do humans go into a kind of hibernation every night when we sleep? The heart rate slows, oxygen saturation drops. Where do you draw the line?
Well, I don't know. Has anyone known a teenager or has a teenager? So this is a really interesting question because yeah, some of these things, our heart rate, we're arresting metabolism, our body temperature drops, as it raises and drops when we go to sleep. So and that becomes some of the argument about, well, bears don't drop 30 degrees, so they're not true hibernators. But the bear people are going to argue against that. So humans, that's interesting. But I'll pass along. This is something I heard at a seminar. So Hank Harlow was one of my major professors at the University of Wyoming with all this bear research. And so he was the person I heard it from, that we actually have the gene for hibernation. In bears, it's activated. In humans, it's not. Now that could be a spectrum, but you know, and then we've got the ethical question. Well, should we activate that gene with genetic engineering, or is it okay if we send people up into space, or you want to put your teenager to sleep until they turn 18? So you know, I just think it's all you know, it's criteria that determine, you know, what it, you know, there's a spectrum in dormancy. But I think that's very fascinating that we have the gene, but it's not active. And we, you know, we are mammals. So most mammals do go into a deep dormancy or hibernation.
Now, is there any indication archaeologically that earlier man did hibernate? To get through the harsh winters?
Yeah, you know, that's interesting. That's something I'd have to look into, because, you know, as long as there's food, you know, animals don't hibernate. You can go to the zoo and see a bear gets food daily. They don't hibernate.
Right.
Sun bears don't hibernate, you know, animals in the tropics. So, yeah, and then you'd have to ask, well, are we talking about in tropical climates, like in Africa, or are we talking about Neanderthals up in, you know, Scandinavia, or, you know, it's just, it's usually a combination of environment, like environmental cold, and food scarcity. So, you know, I don't really have an answer for that, because there's a lot of variables that could enhance that. But yeah, just like be interesting to look up in the record if there's, you know, usually they can tell by bone marrow, or you can tell if people were, or animals were starving, or if they were in good condition, or, you know, kind of be an interesting one to figure out.
Fascinating.
But I think, you know, in general, we're considered a primate in tropical climates. And so we've just been able to adapt to cold climates. We keep eating, whether it's seal blubber or whatever.
Right.
You know.
Well, you know, moving on with that idea that the circumstances affect the hibernation, the temperatures rise. If the temperatures rise, do bears, you know, leave hibernation early? And then if they did, would they go back to hibernation or just stay out there? It's a warm snap.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I didn't really hit on that. That bears can rouse. They can come in and out of hibernation, and I've seen it happen, because there was a spot in Yellowstone where a black bear, she was hibernating. She had her 1-year-old cub with her. I think she had 2. And they were in the den. It was a den site. Black bears often reuse their den sites. And the snow level was not good. That was last year. And it was like a den that normally was covered with snow, which they like. And this year, because the snow was not great, you can actually see her fur. You know, you can see her in the den. And she came out kind of groggy and walked out a little bit and then walked back in. So they can rouse. And, you know, that's the difference between, like, say, rodents, the true hibernators, and bears. Bears have to be ready to go. You know, for all their evolutionary changes, they are able to rouse, and they're also able to run, and they're able to function pretty quickly after coming out of the den. So remember, they haven't lost any muscle mass, they haven't decreased any bone density. They're ready to go. So they've just had different pressures to rather than some big groggy awakening period, or also just be ready to go.
Right.
That answer it? I'm giving you a long-winded answer.
It's interesting to contemplate, even if we don't have answers. I mean, there's so many different tangents to go off on. Let's switch to frogs for a second. Frogs hibernate underwater. So do they not breathe that entire time, or do they respirate through their skin? How do they, what happens with frogs?
Exactly. So exactly, aquatic frogs are underwater, and they're getting they're in an oxygen saturated environment. They can't get enough oxygen in mud like turtles can. So they are across their skin surface able to respirate with oxygen. And it's also like fish. Fish are at the bottom of deep lakes, and they're just in a state of dormancy, and everything just slows way down. But they're in we're looking at Yellowstone. We have really pure oxygen saturated waters, so they're not going to have any problem overwintering.
Okay, I'm going to leave you with one tricky one to contemplate. I'm just guessing there's not a whole lot of research on this, but maybe I'm wrong. Do we know if hibernating mammals dream during hibernation?
Yeah, that has been measured. Wow, I came across that in the literature, and I just kind of glossed over it very quickly, but there is brain activity. So, and once again, these are things that, like, I'm just telling you what I've come across, or I'm not expert in animal dream psychology, but yeah, that brain activity has been measured.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
I'd say I'm just going to say for mammals. Okay. I don't know what's going on with the frogs and snakes.
It's but so mammals. Yeah. These webinars really get you thinking. Well,
yeah, that's great.
Thank you again for sharing your expertise and passion with us. That's the last question we have time for today, so I'll pass it back to you for closing comments.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I think this is all, we've all have wonderful research projects. This is a huge field, and we're only looking at just temperate North America, but over the world, this is just an amazing topic. And I hope everyone, wherever you're living, that you enjoy the rest of winter. It's really a time to look forward to and appreciate.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I also want to thank all of you who tuned in today. Please join us again next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.